and welcome to GameSack. I've done some episodes about franchises that started in 2D and later jumped over to 3D, but I thought it would be fun to look at some that started in 3D but later got some 2D titles. Usually these would end up on the portable consoles of the time. Anyway, I have some picked out, so let's get started. Anyone remember Crash Bandicoot on the original PlayStation from Naughty Dog and Sony? Of course you do. Who could forget about Crash? His first game here came out in 1996, and at that time he was the mascot for the console. Back then, everyone marveled at the visuals for this game, and for good reason. I mean, just look at it. It still looks pretty good, even today. The gameplay itself is pretty simple, but that's definitely not a bad thing. You guide Crash through the various levels and you can spin and smash crates and enemies. Inside certain crates are things that can help you, such as a mask that will let you take an extra hit before you die. Or fruit. Crash collects lots and lots of fruit. Usually your goal is just to make it to the end of the level. Some levels feature a side-scrolling view for more of a 2.5D style of gameplay. And others have you running towards the screen, away from something that will wreck you if you dare slow down. The music is very appropriate for this game, though it's nothing I'd be jamming to on my iPod, hell, not even my Zune. The series would go on and on for more 3D-like adventures, all built out of tons of polygons. In 2002, we got Crash Bandicoot: The Huge Adventure on the Game Boy Advance. This was developed by Vicarious Visions. It's pretty much what you'd expect from Crash in 2D. You still have all of the crates to smash and the fruit to collect. This all works the same way with the bouncing and the spinning and stuff. There are green nitro boxes that you can't touch at all or they'll explode. But there's always a green switch somewhere in the level that'll get rid of them all. You're also looking for a special crystal in each and every level. Naturally, of course, there are boss fights. They even managed to toss in some 3D-like levels using pre-rendered looping backgrounds. They love this point of view in Crash games. There are a total of 20 levels distributed among 4 hubs. The control is very snappy, and if something bad happens here, it's definitely your fault. The graphics are nice and move super fast, but it all has that pre-rendered look, so it's not as sharp as I think it could be. The music is fine, but not really worth mentioning once I finish up this sentence. Okay, I'm done. This is a good version of Crash Bandicoot to play on the go. In 2003, that got a sequel called Crash Bandicoot 2: Entranced, also on the Game Boy Advance, developed by Vicarious Visions. This is more of the same, but in my opinion better. This time, you have an expanding hub world that you can roam around in. In addition to the side-scrolling stages, you also have these isometric Marble Madness style stages. I'm pretty sure that Crash is a polygon here though. These stages are probably the low point of the game only because they're just so damn long. Don't get me wrong, it's fun to roll Crash around here, but if they were shorter, I think it would be better. And of course, you still have the running towards the screen pre-rendered levels. The graphics here are mostly the same quality as the previous game, which is good. However, the music is far better in this entry. This is the preferred Crash Bandicoot entry on the Game Boy Advance, even with the isometric stages. Then there's Crash Bandicoot Purple: Ripto's Rampage. This came out the next year. This feels like a step back in many ways, though Crash still has many of his moves from Part 2. The control is fine, but now you need to collect enough fruit to get past certain gates, and there's more of an urgency to complete the minigame levels like riding these guys. This one is actually a crossover with a game called Spyro Orange: The Cortex Conspiracy. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Nintendo gamers love colors in their game titles. Spyro is another 3D franchise, and I have to admit that I don't know a ton about it. I've only played it once or twice so far. But the Game Boy Advance version is also a 2D game with a large focus on rather boring minigames. I tell ya, these two games can miss me. I'll stick with Crash 2 Entranced, thank you. There's also Crash Nitro Kart on the Game Boy Advance from 2003, developed by Vicarious Visions. This is basically a Mario Kart clone, and it's a pretty good one. I'm not sure how much this one counts as it's using Mode 7 on steroids, but I think it's worth a mention in such an episode. You've got the items, the power sliding, and a hub world. Check it out if you like kart games. Lastly, we have Crash of the Titans, developed by Amaze Entertainment and published by Sierra in 2007. This is on the Game Boy Advance, but it was available as a 3D game on other platforms. This is by far the worst game in this segment. I mean, look at it, it's hideously ugly, and it doesn't even move smoothly. You can stun enemies called Titans and take them over to control them. The game relies very heavily on this. Some of the Crash staples are here, like smashing boxes, but Crash now punches instead of spins, which is really weird. Do yourself a favor and just stick to the first 2 Crash games on this system, and maybe Nitro Kart as well. Panzer Dragoon from Sega was a launch game for the Saturn. You're a dude flying on a dragon. You can tap the button for a normal shot, or you can hold it down, moving the reticle over the enemies to lock on, then release it for a powerful attack that they can't avoid. You can also tap the left and right shoulder buttons to see 360 degrees around your dragon. There are a lot of enemies that show up out of view that you'll need to deal with. It sounds pretty simple, and it is, but it's also quite fun. You're on rails and the game takes you where it wants you to go, at least the action-oriented games in the series. Both the graphics and the music are incredible. This series is something that never saw a bad game in my opinion. Panzer Dragoon Mini came out for the Game Gear at the end of 1996, only in Japan. It was developed by Ritz. This was basically a title for the younger audience, and as a fully grown man and then some, I can definitely tell. It's very easy. You fly into the screen, but make no mistake, this is the Game Gear. It doesn't have 3D capabilities. Interestingly, you're just a baby dragon on its own, no human rider at all. You can fire off your normal shot, or like its big brothers, you can hold down the fire button to lock onto your enemies. Releasing the button causes the enemies to explode. You don't get to see your lock-on shots fire though. Your enemies are just suddenly gone. There's only a few enemies later in the game which will require more than one lock-on hit to kill. Your regular shots aren't very useful, and I recommend using your lock-on shot for all of the normal enemies. Sometimes the view will change, though this happens automatically and you have no control over it. Usually this happens for mid-boss and regular boss battles. For these fights you can still use your lock-ons, but your regular shots are much faster and will defeat the bosses in no time. You'll see all of the bosses more than once during your trip through the game, except for the final boss of course. You have a life bar, and if it runs out, it's game over. Fret not though, as you have a password for each level. Granted, there are only 5 levels here. There's also no story at all. Beat the game and congratulations, you win! This is it, the entire ending. You can pick your dragon in the beginning though, and there are 3 levels of difficulty. The graphics aren't awful by any means, but they are a touch sparse. The music evokes memories of Panzer Dragoon 2, and it was adapted to the Game Gear by Hitoshi Sakimoto. He did Gauntlet 4 on the Genesis. This certainly isn't an awful game, but you'll likely only play through it once. Up next is everyone's favorite 3D platformer. Okay, maybe not everyone's. In fact, maybe no one's. This is Croc from Fox and Argonaut, which came out in 1997. It was released on the Saturn, PlayStation, and PC. Since I mentioned the Saturn version not too long ago, I'm showing the PlayStation version here today. It's a little better than the Saturn version, mainly due to the faster frame rate. Once again, this started life as a Yoshi game until Nintendo told them no. Then Fox picked it up, Yoshi was changed into a crocodile, and here we are. This was one of the first truly 3D platformers ever, and it shows. The gameplay is pretty rough around the edges, though the second analog stick controlling the camera here is welcome. You need to rescue the little furry creatures and make your way to the exit. You also collect lots of jewels along the way. Even with analog control, things aren't exactly precise, but this was still interesting back in its time. 2 years later, we got Croc 2, which was for the PlayStation here and also for the PC. This is a step up as far as gameplay, though it remains quite similar to the original. It's even faster and more responsive here, though weirdly they did take away all functionality from the second analog stick. This one has a hub world, a concept that was gaining popularity in games at the time. The levels here are much bigger, and there's way less loading and interruptions. Even the music is better. Overall, this is a worthy step up if you enjoy Croc. In 2000, Croc made the jump to 2D with Croc on the Game Boy Color. This was developed by Virtua and published by THQ. The controls here are typical: jump with A and do your tail attack with B. It does take some time to get used to though, as the controls are rather twitchy and the game wants to move pretty fast. You still collect jewels here, and there sure are a lot of them. This time though, the jewels are your life meter. Sometimes I noticed that it only started me out with 3 jewels, even though I ended the previous stage with 5, so be sure to keep an eye on it. You also still collect the little furry gobbos here and there, and sometimes you'll need a key to uncage them. Lastly, you collect the letters to spell out the word bonus. If you're unlucky enough to do that, you get to play a sliding puzzle for a chance to, well, I don't know what you get if you win because I have no patience for these things, so I just press start to skip it. The graphics are alright and scroll quickly. The music is familiar but rather abrasive sometimes. Overall, this is a decent 2D game with nothing really much above average. The next year, we got Croc 2, also on the Game Boy Color. This one was developed by Natsume and published by THQ. It's now an overhead exploratory adventure. You have a hub world which will expand the further you get into the game. From here, you take on various levels with different objectives. These levels are extremely maze-like and kind of samey looking. At the same time, it's still more interesting than the first Croc game on the Game Boy Color was. Croc is absolutely gigantic, but there are rarely any other enemies on screen that he needs to worry about. You'll be wandering around these levels quite a bit before you figure out what they want you to do to meet the objective. Croc still has his jump and his tail attack. He can also run by double tapping in any direction. He picks up lots of jewels here for currency. There's a shop here which is similar to the PlayStation Croc 2 game. The graphics and music are both nice, but repetitive. Overall, I think Croc ends up being only slightly above average either in 3D or 2D, but I do applaud this last effort here for trying something different. Here's Air Force Delta on the Dreamcast from Konami. It's called Delta Skies in Europe because they'll have none of that Air Force nonsense. It came out in 1999. This is Konami's take on the Ace Combat style of gameplay. You fly an airplane around and accomplish various missions which have fictional nations in battle. You use your cockpit view to navigate a stage from target to target. Occasionally, you have a very limited time to blow up an enemy before they cross a boundary. These stages suck ass. But the ones where you need to concentrate mostly on ground targets are pretty fun. Between missions, you have a shop where you can buy new aeroplanes with the money that you earned from previous stages. These will often have better specs than the default airplane. But if you lose that airplane in combat, well, it's gone and you'll need to buy it again if you liked it. By the way, can you imagine the real Air Force making pilots buy their own aircraft? This game is pretty good for one of these types, but I think Konami could have done a little better on the system. For one, the graphics are pretty rough. It doesn't support VGA mode, and even if you patch the game with VGA support like I did here, it still looks rather yucky. Why, Konami? Hell, it doesn't look that great on a normal CRT either. However, the music is really good. This is Air Force Delta Storm from Konami, also known as Air Force Delta 2 in Japan. It came out in 2001. Once again, we have Konami's version of the fighter jet game, but this time it's on the impressive and futuristic Xbox console. Now we have a new external view, but you can still choose the cockpit view if you like. The graphics are leaps and bounds better here as you'd expect on the Xbox, but it's still not pushing any console hardware limits here. Now you have a map to work your way around instead of just one mission after the other. Some of these stages are really short and require you to kill only a single enemy. Then you can move on to the next spot on the map as you can't just go directly to any stage. The gameplay is largely the same during the actual stages, with the ground targets being more enjoyable to take out and the aerial dogfights being tricky. The music is still good, but it doesn't stand out quite as much as the Dreamcast game. Overall, this is a good one, but it's not quite criminally overlooked or anything. In 2000, Air Force Delta came out on the Game Boy Color, developed by Climax. Yeah, this looks 3D since you fly into the screen, but come on, it's the Game Boy Color. It has no choice but to be built with 2D assets. Though it does look pretty good for the hardware. Sadly, it doesn't play very well. It's slow, you have very few missiles, and the enemies are difficult to hit. I got bored before the first stage ended. However, fans of intense arpeggios will absolutely appreciate it. In 2002, we got Air Force Delta Storm on the Game Boy Advance, developed by Mobile 21. This doesn't try to be like the Xbox version at all as far as game and mission structure. As you can see, it's now a top-down vertically scrolling game. You can still fly around in 3D space thanks to the revolutionary technology that allows features like scaling and rotation. That's right, you need to watch your altitude here. If whatever you're chasing after is too high or too low, it'll say up or down next to the triangle indicator pointing at your enemy. This is your cue that you need to change your altitude one way or the other. Some stages, like this canyon, won't let you adjust your altitude at all because you're supposed to fly through the rocks. And it's a long way to your target, so you need to be very careful. Oh, ouch, guess I have to fly through all that again. Like the other games, you don't need to destroy absolutely everything, just the items marked in red on your map. So be sure to use the two maps at the bottom corners of your screen to prioritize your flight path, and don't try to follow every little enemy triangle that pops up on your HUD. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but this one can still be lots of fun. The graphics make nice use of the Game Boy Advance's features for the most part. The music is fine, but it's nowhere near as good as the 3D games. I feel that this series works best in 3D. What do you think? Almost everyone loves this next franchise. I'm not kidding, they do. But notice I said almost. That's right, you can't please everyone, especially me. Tomb Raider, developed by Core and published by Eido, showed up on the Saturn and the PlayStation in the latter part of 1996. I always showed a PlayStation version when I mentioned this game, so instead, let's enjoy the Saturn version today. Unfortunately, enjoyment is something I've never been able to experience much of with this game, or really the entire series. I do like the more modern entries better. However, my opinion is not a common one, as tons and tons of people love this series. I mean, it received sequel after sequel after sequel. So yeah, people who are not me definitely do like this. Anyway, as Lara Croft, you run around and play Indiana Jones, only less interesting. The graphics are actually quite good for the time despite how primitive you might think it looks now. I do feel that this particular entry needs much better sound design. There's rarely any music at all, and you mostly only ever hear footsteps. It wasn't until the year 2000 that we got Tomb Raider on the Game Boy Color. This was developed by Core themselves. This is a side-scrolling game that plays like what they call a cinematic platformer. You know, games like the original Prince of Persia or Flashback. That means the control is very stilted, and for someone like me, well, it takes a while to get used to. Up jumps, and you also have a run button, and doing running jumps always makes me feel nervous. Anyway, you're wandering around through various levels, pulling switches and whatnot. You grab items by crouching on them. You have a gun that you can call up by pressing select, and you use it with the action button. It automatically aims at your nearest enemy. You'll be shooting things like snakes, scorpions, and bats. I assume there's plenty more to shoot at in this game, but man, I suck at it and I can't get very far. There are save points here, so that's good. The graphics look a bit silly at first, but they animate well, as these types of games tend to. The sound is perhaps even more sparse than the original 32-bit Tomb Raider game. In 2001 saw the release of Tomb Raider Curse of the Sword, also on the Game Boy Color. The gameplay is exactly like the last Game Boy Color game. However, here you get graphical button prompts when you interact with something, as opposed to no prompts in the previous game. This one is also a lot less forgiving, so you need to be extra careful even right in the beginning. If you like cinematic platformers, then you should probably check out these two games. Then in 2002 we got Lara Croft Tomb Raider: The Prophecy on the Game Boy Advance, developed and published by Ubisoft. This one uses an overhead perspective. Aside from some repetition, it's honestly not bad. The main gist of the game is running around, climbing ledges, and pushing switches to open the path to the next area. Along the way you'll collect plenty of stuff like weapons, medkits, and artifacts like magical stones. Lara's moves here should be familiar to anyone who's played the original games. She can jump and grab the ledge if you press the action button quickly enough. She can even scooch along certain ledges. And she has a meter which will let her run even faster for a brief amount of time. You press R to arm yourself and fire with the action button. Lara sure likes shooting wolves, and there are tons of them in this game. There are other enemies too, and they'll all bleed when they get shot. That's right, even the skeletons bleed. The levels here are big, but not too big. They're well partitioned so they never become overwhelming. I like the graphics and animation a lot, but I do wish there were more variety in the various locales. The sound is better than the original game with more ambience, but otherwise it isn't too noteworthy. I had a fairly decent time with this one. It's not perfect, but it also doesn't have any huge flaws other than getting a bit boring. But fortunately, the password feature means that you can take as many breaks as you'd like. 4 years later, in 2006, we got Tomb Raider Legend on the Game Boy Advance. This game was also released on many 3D native platforms. It was developed by Crystal Dynamics and published by Eidos. The GBA version here reverts back to the cinematic platformer genre, only it spices things up significantly. The game moves extremely fast for a game of this type, and the controls have changed around somewhat compared to the Game Boy Color games. It's certainly not something that you can't get used to unless you were just playing those other games like I was. The A button is dedicated to shooting unless you have something else selected, and B is for jumping. You no longer have a run button because damn, Lara moves fast enough as it is now. The guns don't look like they aim automatically, but I think they still do because look at me killing this beast here. There are lots of puzzles to solve in this one, and if you die, you can try them over and over as much as you'd like. There are also some more action-oriented rooms, with some of them being pretty short. There are even thwomp enemies in here, so that means this game is every bit as good as any Mario game. It's not always your fault if you die, with the controls being as they are. The graphics are pretty good, though Lara and all of the enemies are pre-rendered, and boy do they look it with their weird movement. Music is almost always playing, and generally this is a decent sounding game, especially if you like things that are in mono. I'll say this, I'd rather play this one than the Game Boy Color games. Virtua Fighter from Sega came to the arcades at the end of 1993. Most people consider this to be the first 3D fighting game ever, probably because it is. It's your typical one-on-one fighter where you need to win 2 out of 3 rounds. The fighting itself, however, was not typical for the games of its time. It's far more technical as far as your timing, defense, and whatnot go. There are no fancy fireballs or super moves, no special gauges, just fighting. You also have ring outs that you need to be careful about. The graphics, though extremely dated, still look appealing in my opinion. The music is pretty nice as well, especially the arrangements that showed up on the Saturn home port. Virtua Fighter got 4 sequels, like Virtua Fighter 2. This was a huge step up over the original game in basically every single area. The visuals are now much more detailed and polished, especially the backgrounds. 2 new characters were added. There are still no fireballs, flaming uppercuts, or hell, not even sonic booms. That didn't stop these games from being immensely popular, especially in Japanese arcades. So popular were these games that Sega decided to release Virtua Fighter animation on the old Game Gear in 1996. Now, I'm not sure if you can notice, but there are some differences between this and the original games. There's a story mode where you get cutscenes between each fight, and those characters join you and become selectable after you beat them. You'll also notice the 3 size options. This is normal, where the fighters are pretty dang small. Or you can choose large, which borrows a bit of that Mode 7 look from the Super Nintendo but gives you giant fighters. Then there's real time, where the fighters will shrink or grow depending on how far apart the fighters are from each other, just like a Neo Geo fighting game. Only way better, obviously. This is the Sega Game Gear. Suffice it to say, the control is slower and stiff, but you can still get most of your moves out. Start acts as your guard button. I never press it anyway. Defensively, you can no longer roll away from your opponent if you're on the ground. Ring outs are still here, and they can sometimes be tough to avoid. Still, it won't take you long to beat both the story mode and the regular versus computer modes. There's no link mode available to play with a second player. Brazil got a fully fledged Master System version of this one. The screen here is wider, but the number of colors is slightly reduced. The large and real-time modes are gone, so this size is all you get. Oh, and the guard button is gone since the Master System doesn't have an actual start button. However, it does gain a 2-player mode. Also, this version feels substantially easier than the Game Gear game. A couple of months later, Sega decided to release Virtua Fighter 2 on the Genesis. Gameplay-wise, everything is here, except for the things that are missing, which is a lot. It also feels strange to play because it's so choppy. I can't seem to roll out of the way of incoming attacks, and believe me, I do try. Supposedly, it can be done in this version though. They must have gotten something right though, because I can make it just as far in this game before I start to die as the real Virtua Fighter 2. I'd say this one plays decently for a 2D conversion, and it's surprisingly faithful, all things considered. Some of the stages are missing. For example, why am I fighting Pi on Akira's stage? Some characters are also completely missing. The ground is about the only thing that has any visual pizzazz. It goes a bit above and beyond the typical line-scrolling floors that we're used to seeing from Street Fighter 2 and the like. The music does a pretty good job, and it doesn't sound too shabby, though it is in mono. The voices and the other digitized sounds, however, are extremely grainy. Overall, this isn't an awful fighting game, but it's certainly not the preferred way to play it. I'm surprised that Sega felt there was a market for a 16-bit version of this. And there you go, some 2D games from 3D franchises. A lot of these were honestly a lot better than I was expecting, but I think in most cases, the 3D games are the way to go. So what are some other 3D franchises that have some 2D titles in them that I should check out? Let me know. In the meantime, thank you for watching GameSack. I don't have the time nor the mental capacity to deal with so many buttons on a single controller. Well, now there's an adapter to use a Sega Master System controller on your Neo Geo. Just plug your Master System controller into the adapter and then into the Neo Geo. With just 2 buttons, you can concentrate on winning. I do a lot better at games when my brain isn't seizing up due to having to deal with too many buttons simultaneously. Now you're playing like a champion. I can deal with 2 buttons. You lost. Almost. Ordered the Master to Neo adapter today.